Kelly. It's ego, friend, or foe. Just want to make sure you have one.
Week 36, ego, friend or foe. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it and your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Christ begins his Beatitudes with the words, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit in such a way as to merit the kingdom of heaven doesn't mean to be poor-spirited. Rather, it means to see oneself as owning nothing, since all belongs to God, for all is a manifestation of his consciousness. St. John of the Cross wrote, "If you would own everything, seek to own nothing. That which the ego relinquishes, offering up to the soul consciousness, is reclaimed forever in cosmic consciousness. Nothing is ever lost." Paramahansa Yogananda tells a story, an autobiography of a yogi, of the levitating saint. "Master," said the disciple of the saint once ardently, "you are wonderful. You have renounced riches and comforts to seek God and teach us wisdom. It is well known that Baduri Mahashaya has forsaken great family wealth in his early childhood, even when single-handedly he entered the yogic path. You are reversing the case." The saint's face held mild rebuke. "I have left a few paltry rupees, a few petty pleasures for the cosmic empire of endless bliss. How then have I denied myself anything? I know the joy of sharing the treasure. Is that a sacrifice?" The short-sighted worldly folk are verily the real renunciates. They relinquish all unparalleled divine possession for a poor handful of earthly toys. The Bhagavad Gita in the 3rd chapter states, "All things are everywhere by nature wrought, in interaction of the qualities. The fool cheated by self thinks, this I did, and that I wrought. But, thou strong-armed prince, a better lessoned mind, knowing the play of visible things within the world of sense, and how the qualities must qualify, standeth aloof even from his acts. Thus, through the Bhagavad Gita, the Holy Bible proclaims, and God has spoken to mankind." Oh, oh, oh.
Thanks, Kel. Oh, he hands you my glasses too. Sorry. Oh boy, that was exciting. Yeah, it's power. Sorry, Master. For those at home, we knocked over a big, beautiful poster of Yogananda when I brought this stand over. I just need a moment to recuperate. Okay, thank you. All right, good morning again, everyone. We'll start with a beautiful prayer demand from Yogananda's Whispers from Eternity, number 196. For those reading at home, reinforce thou all our blended prayers. The streamlets of our prayers rush out and conjoin with the well springs of our hearts, uniting in a single mighty flow. Our broad, deep, flowering rivers of prayer move swiftly toward thy oceanic presence, breaking all narrow embankments of indifference, dissolving every eddy and large whirlpool of worldly desire, flowing freely over protruding rocks of bad habits and straightening the once winding ways of delusion. Our great river of devotion crosses sands of human oblivion, uncounted lives lost in eternity to present memory, and inundates every trace of past trials and painful past experience. Yet even now, thy shores seem far away. Doggedly, our flood moves on toward thy sea of shining vastness. Pour thou unceasingly the raindrops of thy mercy, swelling the flood of our prayers, that they reach at last triumphantly thine ever waiting shores. I'm going to hand that to you, Nancy. Thank you, just so I don't have to put it on the ground. Thank you very much. So good morning again, everyone. Just going to lower this a tiny bit. No, maybe not. It's just one of those mornings. So today we get to talk about the ego, friend or foe, everyone's favorite subject on the spiritual path. And one of the great spiritual truths, which is also a great irony, is that before we can begin to learn to dissolve the ego, we have to express it in its highest form. We have to go through lifetimes of really exploring the ego to the pinnacle. And there's a continuum. We have many, many, many lifetimes through time and space where we explore all of our desires, our wishes for fame, for power, for wealth. And then we also have our individual lifetimes where, again, we repeat a smaller cycle of those same desires. And it's something that, again, happens over a long spectrum of time. And in today's reading, we talk about Baduri Mahashaya, the levitating saint, and people around him were just fascinated that as a child, he gave up wealth and privilege and status to go onto the yogic path. And that seems so strange to people, but we have to put it in the context that in that particular lifetime, he had already gone through all of the cycles of extreme ego expression. And, you know, the same thing with Buddha. Buddha in his early adulthood, he was a prince. He was Mahata Siddhartha, and he gave up the family name and the palace and the jewels and went out to find spiritual liberation, because both of these saints realized that there was no happiness in the things of the material world. And we see that sometimes in our culture. Every now and then you'll see a celebrity who's really reached the highest point of fame with money and wealth and success. And then at a certain point, they'll admit that they're not happy and that they turn to meditation, or they take up a spiritual mantle and then they become a spokesperson for something like that. It's always interesting to watch. And so we have to remember that each one of us has had that same experience as well in our lifetimes. We've all had wealth, we've all had power, maybe even some fame. And by the time we are attract the guidance of a great guru like Yogananda, it means that we're ready to leave that behind. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it happens overnight. We spend this whole incarnation kind of scratching away at that feeling of the things we want and the things we wish we had versus what we know in our heart is right for us. So I want to talk a little bit about another story that has a similar slant to it, and that's the Tiger Swami in the Autobiography of a Yogi. So the Tiger Swami was known throughout the land for his ability, his power, and his strength. Today we're talking about power in the affirmation. His power and strength to be able to tame wild tigers, go into the jungle and tame them until they were like little kitty cats doing what he asked. And he had become quite well known, quite famous for this. And Yogananda, as a boy, went to visit him to hear these tales of the Tiger Swami. And he told Yogananda and his friend that at the pinnacle of his fame, a sadhu or a saint went to his father and made a prediction and said, your son must give away his tiger taming because he is basically karmically sinning against the animal kingdom, you know, making these animals feel humiliation. And that the next time he goes out to tame a tiger, he will be very seriously injured and he'll have a very long recuperation. He'll be close to death. And at the end of that, he'll become a monk. So when the Tiger Swami heard this prediction, he didn't think much of it. And he went on vacation to a neighboring area in India. And when he got there, this premonition had spread through the land. because people like to talk about these types of things. And his reputation preceded him. So when he got there, the king of that kingdom basically went to him and said, I want you to fight my tiger that I just caught, my men just caught in the wild, called Raja Begum. He's the biggest tiger anyone's ever seen in India. He's fierce, and I want you to prove your abilities to me, because he thought that the tiger Swami was giving the tigers opium to try to sedate them and then making them do tricks, but he wasn't. So he took the challenge on, and he went into this huge forum with thousands of people watching. He had to get into a cage with the tiger, and he had to chain the tiger and then subdue him and leave the cage alive. Well, he was very badly injured, maimed, almost killed. But in the end, he gathered his strength and he did knock the tiger unconscious, put a chain around his neck, left, and he succeeded in this challenge. And when he came out, the prince or king garlanded him and threw coins at his feet. And this was the pinnacle of his fame as a tiger tamer. But at that very moment, he said something changed in his heart. And he realized what he was doing was superficial, and that there was no need for this, that it wasn't truly what would bring him lasting happiness. When he returned home, he met with the saint, and then he changed his life and he became a sadhu and a monk. And, he told Yogananda and his friend that basically what we're trying to do is tame the beast of the ego within ourselves. We're trying to tame the thoughts and the desires and all those things that take up our mind. They roam in the hollows of our mind all day long. And that's really spiritual strength and power, is to do that. And I wanted to show you this picture. I'm sure you've seen this. Yogananda with the tiger. And let's see it, David. So the first time I saw this picture was, about 25 years ago. And my first thought was, oh, the poor tiger. And I was just getting to know Yogananda, and I was like a little bit disturbed. I wondered if he had killed the tiger, but he didn't kill the tiger, just so everyone knows. And now when I look at this, I realize, so he's got it's a tiger skin. It's not a live tiger, but he has his hands and his arms over the tiger. And basically the tiger is a symbol of our ego. And for Yogananda to take this photo, it was just a reminder that that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to tame the tiger of our ego. And all of these practices that we participate in on this path is what does that for us. So basically, the more we let God into our life, the less hold the ego has on us. And some of you may remember this, old timers, when we used to go to the yurt in Hopkinton. Maybe once a year, Prem Shanti and Om Prakash would do this sort of demonstration where they would take a glass of Coca-Cola that was about halfway filled, and then they'd have a big pitcher of water. And the Coca-Cola, the glass represents us, the Coca-Cola represents our ego, and the pitcher of water represented God. And they would put it in a big bowl, and they'd start pouring the water into the glass of Coca-Cola. And because there was so much water, the Coca-Cola would then turn to a lighter brown and lighter until there was no more Coca-Cola. It was just clear, pure water. And essentially, I almost thought about doing it today, but it's messy. But it's a great example of what happens when we let God into our lives like that. When God's vibration pours into us, there's no more room for the ego. The ego starts to dissipate. The ego starts to remove itself. The cork of ignorance comes out. And then we can really, truly be who we are in God's eyes, because what God has in mind for us is so much more spectacular than what we think we want or we think we need. And that's just the truth of the spiritual path. Yogananda's prayer that we did this morning, I will reason, I will act. I will reason, I will act, but guide thou my reasoning, willpower, and activity to the right path in everything. So we need to have enough ego to just use ourselves as a channel of God's light. We do need an ego to be in the human body, but we want to use it to open ourselves to let God's light flow through in our lives. So God's will for us, again, is always much more powerful than what we ourselves can imagine. So power, it was the affirmation today. And there's a difference between power, which is born of ego. We see that all around us when someone has a big, strong ego and they're trying to assert their power over other people. It's totally different than the power of God's vibration flowing through us. And Jesus said we can move mountains when we attune our consciousness to the Christ consciousness. And that's the kind of power that we're talking about. And that's the kind of power that we want to have flow through us in our lives to help affect change. You know, we did purification today, and we're doing these mantras to help level out the energy of the world right now. Our light, our love, our spiritual power can help bring harmony back into the earth. And so what a great honor for us as lovers of God and disciples of a great guru to be those channels in the world right now. We have a wonderful event coming up in a couple of weeks in Boston that Inez has been working for over a year on preparing for us. And it's a really wonderful opportunity to kind of sort of reignite, charge your battery. Usually to go to an event of this caliber, we'd have to go all the way to California, to Ananda Village, or to Assisi, or to India. We get to do it right here in Boston. So anyone who's hasn't committed yet, I really encourage you to come and experience the vibration of Asha, who's an incredibly powerful, loving, kind, compassionate channel of Yogananda's light and love. So it'll be a wonderful thing. Let's see, it's getting a little bit late. Sadhu Beware is a wonderful book. If you haven't read it yet, it's Swami Kriyananda talks about how to be an ego detective in that book. And there's things that we can do. Whenever we are in a situation where we feel tension, like even a tension headache or tension in the shoulders and the back of the neck, that's a sign that maybe we're going from ego consciousness, that we're using our ego to move through the world. And if we feel that happening, then the antidote to that is to bring our awareness through the brain to the point between the eyebrows, the Agya chakra. Because whenever we let the energy move through to the spiritual eye, it dissipates that ego energy. It's a very powerful thing. And we also feel ego consciousness in our heart. If we feel irritated, angry, upset, those are all, even sadness sometimes, those are all ego, the ego basically trying to take control of our peace. So these are all little ways that we can become aware of when the ego is coming in and taking over. The most incredible thing that we have going for us is that we have the teachings of a self-realized master. It's amazing, isn't it? It's such a beautiful, beautiful gift. And we have the Hong Sa technique. And I just want to talk about that for a minute because we kind of take it for granted. We meditate and Hong Sa, you know, sometimes we get a little lazy with it, but it's one of the most powerful mantras there is. And Yogananda specifically gave it to us for spiritual liberation. So every time we mentally inhale Hong, energetically, we talked about the vibratory power of mantra, energetically, that sound comes up through the astral spine and brings the Kundalini up through each of our chakras, through the medulla oblongata, which is the seat of ego, and through the brain to the spiritual eye. So simply by mentally breathing and repeating Hong, we're pulling the energy out of the ego center into the spiritual center. And then when we exhale Sa, the same happens, it reverses back down. So just by doing this simple, powerful practice every day, we start to change in really profound ways. And anyone who's practiced Hong Sa for even 6 months or a year or 10 years or 20 years can attest to what it does, how it changes our life. Swami Kriyananda once was in a seclusion for 3 or 4 days. And when he came out, he saw Asha. And she said his whole countenance was like surrounded in light and he was beaming. And he said, Asha, we can find liberation through Hong Sa. So he spent those 3 days just practicing Hong Sa. He didn't even practice his Kriyas. And he had an experience. I don't know what the experience was, but he had some kind of very powerful experience of cosmic consciousness through the Hong Sa technique. But you know, it's not easy to do this because the ego doesn't want us to meditate. The ego doesn't want to be dissolved. Imagine if you knew of a situation that if you went there, you would lose your life. You would try to stay away from that, wouldn't you? Like if you knew if you went to a certain place or participated in an activity, you would lose your life. You wouldn't do that. So the ego kind of feels that way about Hong Sa. The ego feels threatened. It's like, wait a minute, if I go there, I'm going to become weaker and I might even disappear to a point where I don't recognize myself anymore. So it's a really powerful thing. So every time we get pulled aside, there's so many ways we can get pulled aside. There's ways we can even get pulled aside spiritually by feeling that maybe there's a different mantra that might be better for us, or maybe there's a different teacher, or maybe there's something else we could try. And it's okay to do all of those things. But once you become a disciple of a great master, it's a gift. It's like someone's handing you $1 million jackpot, only it's worth $1 billion. It's the whole wealth of the universe that master's offering us through these particular techniques. So that's my spiel for today, is to just really go into the practices and re-look at them. If you're new to this, it's great, because when you're new, there's a lot of concentration and there's a lot of commitment, and you're really feeling the technique in a certain way. But for some of us that have been doing it for a long time, we can get a little bit lazy sometimes or lethargic in our practice. So it's really important to become really aware when that happens and to look at it again. Maybe go back and read the Raja Yoga book, or maybe read Jyotish's book, How to Meditate, and kind of reacquaint yourself with the technique and what it means and how it can transform our lives. So basically, discipleship is the answer to overcoming ego. Our attunement with God and our guru is the absolute guarantee for us eventually to reach spiritual liberation. So as we go through these cycles of lifetimes, it's very exciting to think that we might be in the lifetime right now where we can reach liberation, because we've explored the ego consciousness and we're ready to let some of those things go. So just take that into your heart and your mind and into your meditations today. We are going to meditate this afternoon, and I think we might spend a little time kind of going through Hong Sa slowly today, just so we can feel that energy and vibration. Peace.